My story is one of heritage. Specifically, it begins with my mother. You see, my mother was a proud wolf of the Lamar Valley pack. Raised in the security of a large pack, she fed on the powerful prey, which our kind calls Riki, of her homelands. She harnessed their strength as her own, and as she grew, she became robust and sure-footed, her pelt thick and sleek. With such bounty in the land and harmony within her own pack, she had no reason to leave, and she found fulfillment helping the next two litters grow until Shifshire, or the time that they would leave their birth pack to form their own. She was content. Of course, happiness often doesn't last. In the summer, a large rival pack appeared at their borders. Almost double the size of Mother's pack, they resentfully watched these wolves settle on the edges of their territory. Desperate, the lean wolves fell upon Mother's Hariki, leaving little for her family. Upon seeing the barren lands left to them in the wake of the rival pack, Mother's family resolved to drive out the intruders. Skirmishes became common, brief but fierce whenever individual members crossed paths, leaving deep wounds marring the pelts of both packs. My mother watched as her sister rotted from the inside out of one such gash, leaving only bones. Relationships between the packs only worsened after her death, but it all culminated in one last battle at the cusp of winter. Howling to rally forces and intimidate one another, my mother's family gave each other one last resolving glance before throwing themselves at the intruders in hopeless defense of their homeland. They were, of course, outnumbered, and Mother's parents were aging but not deterred. Better a fast death than a lingering one, was what Mother said of their grim resolve. My mother did not yet understand this, still being young and hopeful, and she threw herself headfirst into the throng. Mother fought viciously, tearing at any unfamiliar pelt before her. She was covered in her own blood from wounds she did not yet feel when her primary adversary finally succumbed to a deep bite to the throat. Dropping the corpse, she saw her mother's two halves beside her, several large wolves zooming over the kill. Looking for the first time past determination and bloodlust, she saw the scavengers gathering at the outskirts of the battle, preparing already to feast on her as they would her mother. Trembling and inconsolable, she ran, blind to her destination. She could feel the hot breath of the wolf that still had her mother's blood on his tongue, chasing after her as she escaped. She did not dare stop, and she did not know at what point in her flight this breath turned from the actual snarling menace of her rival to just the echoes of the wind. She would never know what fate befell her brothers and sisters. She could only hope that they got away as she had, but she never dared to look back for them. She ran for days on end until the stench of wolf faded entirely, and for good reason. My mother was in a busy place of man. My mother told me, "All wolves fear man, for all man hates that which he fears." Mother was no exception to this instinct, but that season she learned not to fear the strange bipedal creatures. At least she reached the point where she could hear their strange calls and not feel the trembling of her legs. As long as she stayed away in the farther forests, they took no heed of her. She wondered if they even knew if she was there. Both went about their lives, separately, but peacefully. At first, she didn't realize that something terrible had happened to them. The season changed, harsh, but she had endured worse. She only heard distant echoes of their loud calls, and the smell of acrid burning from their migrating metal beasts lingered for days. Such events weren't entirely uncommon. She didn't even notice the silence that fell afterwards, so it did prickle her pelt at times. But one day, on her usual patrol through her territory, she noticed that the air around their settlement was cleaner. It was quieter. As she crested a ridge, she watched their den standing empty. Their shadows still roamed the streets, crying desperately for their people and taking out their vicious frustrations on one another. At first, my mother thought that the men must have suffered the same fate as her. She watched the desolate dens with some sympathy and awaited the inevitable strangers. However, the conquerors never came. In the coming seasons, the changes they had so painstakingly made to their surroundings began to fall into disrepair. As the plans took root over rock, mortar, and stone, man's smell began to fade, and the Vriki started to make their homes in the shadow of man. My mother did not. She did not trust making her home in that of another's, especially man's. Yet there are others, those that smell like wolves but are not, the Ateru. From the trickster, to the scavenger, to the man's shadow. These all found homes in the scraped-out dens of man, the surrounding forest taking to these homes as naturally as a hollow of roots. The seasons continued to shift in their cycle. My mother grew unaccustomed to man's absence as swiftly as she had accepted their new presence. As the snows began to fall more regularly, my mother's loneliness felt more heightened with every snowflake on her pelt. She knew the days of her family's pack were over. It was time to move on. She dreamed of a family she created, a pack of her own. She cast about for any sign of another wolf in these strange lands, but all of her questions on the blustering breeze went unanswered. Mother howled until her voice was gone, but the only thing around her was a dark winter. In that moment, Mother wondered if she was the only wolf remaining. She laid down in the blizzard of the darkest night, allowing the snows to envelop her. Yet, out of the falling snow, she saw a face appear. Her heart skipped a beat. He was large, long-legged, and barrel-chested. He was different than she, yet of the Ateru she knew he was not that different to her. He was a man's shadow, smaller than she, but similar in body shape. When she looked into his eyes, she saw herself mirrored, and her snarl torn a stranger away died on her lips. They shared their warmth that night, and for the first time she tried to communicate with him. She had never felt such a need to speak to a lesser Ateru before. Surprisingly, he spoke back readily. She found the ways of the Ateru's speech strange, and while he spoke thickly and with some words she did not know, they could largely understand one another. As time passed, my mother found herself growing attached to him. She told me that his name was Bastion, a foreign name provided by man, and a word that she was never fully sure she had understood correctly. He did not like talking about what happened to the man that gave him that name. My mother and Bastion grew closer as the days grew longer. Yet with time their differences also grew. He did not sing with her to the sky to celebrate their strength, but raised his voice in a sharp staccato that my mother, and the Variki, found startling. He would do this whenever he got too excited and would sometimes spoil a good hunt this way to the ire of my mother. Even so, he was smart, kind, and brave. My mother told me she always thought of him as a mate, but man's touch prevented her from having pups with him. For a long time, she had thought this was a fault that lay with her. Even still, he was a loyal companion to her. My mother and Bastion grew old together over many seasons, having many triumphs and upsets in the natural dance of life. My mother was beginning to slow, Bastion even more so, as another autumn fell. Bastion had found a fallen bull, killed by a rival elk to secure his females. The carcass was a prize that would feed them for days. He called for my mother in his own strange way, and she came as quickly as her creaky bones would allow. She didn't think she took so long in getting there, yet when she arrived she found him lying protectively over the carcass, a great boar grizzly over him, and the fatal wound on his throat, the blood of Riki and Ateru mingling below the great beast. She did not know why Bastion did not yield the carcass to the bear. Not even the two of them together could have driven away at this point in their life's journey. She mourned him, her strange Ateru companion, for the rest of the season. But as winter fell, her memories of her loneliness came back fresh with the new fallen snow. She had forgotten how lonely she had been before. She did not want to feel that lonely ever again. She did smell wolf on the distant breezes now, but after so much time, she felt hesitant. She did not trust the large pack slowly encroaching on the forest of her home, fearing that they would kill her for any wrongdoing, that she would not be able to stop them. She did not even know she could communicate with her own kind as she once had, having spent so long in the company of a Ateru other. Instead, one day, a young, handsome scavenger crossed her path. He gave a strange howl, one that reminded her more of her own than Bastion's meager attempts ever had. The scavenger seemed surprised when Mother spoke to him, but he eagerly reciprocated. His dialect was strange in ways that Bastion's had not been, but having spent so long learning the Ateru's ways, she found it easier to understand him than she may have once had. For a scavenger, he was large, with strikingly dark markings around his eyes that my mother found intriguing. He was not lonely despite having been alone for the season, But he too found my mother fascinating. The young scavenger was very forward with her, flirting in ways Bastion never had. She found it foreign but welcomed the intention all the same. Soon he had won her heart with his silver tongue and strange tales of his Ateru ancestors. Although he was inexperienced, he proved himself to be a thoughtful Ateru and a good companion for my mother. The following spring she found herself with pups for the first time ever, an exciting but dangerous complication in her elder years. Her young mate was eager to prove himself. He was an adept hunter and provided my mother with many hares. My mother found herself needing to eat more than ever to feed the pups in her belly. Luckily, in the winter and early spring, the elk were weak, and she was able to scavenge with her a few meals. On occasion, she found she had to help one along a little bit quicker. My mother was kept fed, and in the spring found herself with her first and last litter. I know her delivery was hard. Giving birth for her first time as an elder likely hurt her in ways she would never say to us. She told me I lost a brother and sister before they even drew breath, but there were 5 of us remaining. After we were born, my mother was too weak to hunt or even scavenge, resting deep in the den. She relied entirely upon her mate to keep her, and us, fed. My mother tells us that our father tried his best, but that scavengers predominantly hunted small prey for themselves, and took pieces off of larger carcasses. He hunted constantly, barely stopping to rest or even eat himself. But as we grew, my mother couldn't produce enough milk to feed all of us. When my younger sister died, my mother tells me that my father was heartbroken. He mourned her deeply. He told us he should have done more. And yet, after that, he left. I don't really remember him, to be honest. We weren't yet out of the den when we woke and realized that something had changed. According to my mother, the death of my sister broke my father in a way that she had become hardened from the tragedies of her own life. Yet, such grief was fresh and gaping for our young father. Their differences and the stress of the constant hunting finally came to a head and led to his leaving us entirely. She forgave him in the same breath that she told us this. I could not offer him the same grace. After my father left, things got much worse for us. My mother, barely able to walk, fought hard for what food she could to feed us. It was still not enough. One of my older brothers died before tasting meat. My last brother died soon thereafter, some strange thing in his jaw making the transition from milk to solid impossible for him. I did not miss them. I felt only relief that no more food would go to their bellies and not my own. My remaining sister and I fought each other viciously for any scraps we could get, hunger a constant pain in our stomachs. I still have some scars on my muzzle from her baby teeth as she rushed to get a meal first, angry at my transgression for daring to try and take some for myself. I'm sure that she could say the same. It got easier once it was just the 2 of us and Mother. Mother was able to supply us with food she got while she was away, and in the meantime we played in the long grasses and slept in the cool earth den when we got too tired or too warm in the lengthening days. Sometimes large, scary things would bear fang and talon at us, but somehow Mother was always there to send them away with a ferocious growl. I loved her dearly for her devotion to us, but even as young as I was, I could see that the strain of providing for us was killing her. My sister and I were nearly grown when we found Mother laying in the tall, late summer grass a small distance away. She looked peaceful in a way I had never before seen her. By this time, we couldn't remember the last time we had seen Mother eat for herself, and sickness had hung onto her pelt like ivy. We were not surprised to find ourselves alone, but we were greatly saddened by her departure. Young and inexperienced, we struggled to hunt for ourselves even as we grew into our adult sizes. My bones ached with my growth, but I knew I would never be as large or as powerful as Mother was. She had a natural bulk to her body that we would never possess thanks to our scavenger heritage. Our smaller statures and lean legs did allow us to hunt small rodents for ourselves, sometimes even digging them out of their burrows, but I longed to bring down much larger prey. I could only dream how it would feel to have a properly full belly, never mind excess. Even at our age, my sister and I would fight for any carcass we happened across, which were often hares, a prize I still found dissatisfying even if it took the edge off my hunger. Sometimes we would even find 2 and our bickering was quieted for a moment. While I aspired to be the wolf that my mother was, my sister found solace in the way of the scavenger. She apparently remembered our father telling stories of the rich heritage that came from his line, other deities and lessons, but I remembered none of these. She often remarked about how our father spoke, in a rich, lilting way that was very different from that of our mother, who was often grunt and to the point. My sister loved listening to our father's stories, likely the same ones that won our mother's heart. I felt these to be fanciful thoughts of one who had abandoned us, and likely thoughts rooted in fiction. While I did not think I could take the life of any whose blood I shared, perhaps not even any Ateru, given my mother's first mate, I did not look at the body of scavengers with grief. My sister mourned every one in case it was our missing father. We began to find wolf tracks in mother's territory, and once even a fallen wolf covered in small wounds. But while my sister felt relieved of the burden of a threat of a larger, and likely hostile, adversary, this find only filled me with deep unease. She felt that these finds were also opportunities to get a better meal to line our hollow bellies, but I always snarled her away. I could not understand how she could stomach to eat any one of her own, no matter how many days it may have been. Our first winter, my sister and I parted ways. Mostly grown, we found our differences were too large to overcome, and we found no relief in each other's company. By now, the several large packs my mother had been leery of at the twilight of her life had fully settled in the forests of her home. They still stayed away from man's territory, likely having been taught mother's same lesson, but I had no such fear of their strange dens. They had gone generations ago now. Viriki were plentiful there. I knew that here would be my homeland, safely secluded from the might of the full-blooded wolves, but innately stronger than the other Ateru. I felt powerful for the first time in my life. If anything, I found some relief in the larger wolves' wariness of their territory. If wolves feared man, but I did not, then perhaps there was something even more courageous within me than in the full-blooded. Even after I stopped growing, I became more comfortable in my pelt, finding solace in the strength of my lean legs to bring me from danger. I knew that I would be hated by wolf and Ateru alike, both of which would likely only see other in me. But as they only saw other, I only saw myself. With my growth and confidence, I learned how to hunt properly, even bringing down deer that were already so weak the ravens were waiting. I knew the ravens belonged to wolves. They had seemed to follow my mother everywhere, watching her in adoration. They did not seem to hold me to the same regard, but I knew one day they would respect me. Everything born of the wolf was my heritage, too. The following fall season, as I watched the elk compete for the attention of females, I began to feel a pang within myself. I had been surprisingly fine on my own up to this time. I knew how isolation had destroyed my mother, but a not insignificant part of me had found it liberating. This season, though, I began to think for the first time of what she had given her life to provide for. A family, a mate, pups, a pack, the birthright of a true wolf. For the first time, I thought about what that meant and what it could be for me. Could it be for me? I resolved that I would find a proper mate who did not care about my unorthodox heritage, and would come live with me in my territory. But first, I had to prove I was truly a wolf. I had to hunt their prey, elk. And then, well, only the future knows. Oh yeah, that's right. If you want to know my story, you should probably know more of who I am. My name? Yes, I was given one by my father. But it's not Wolf. It's Ateru. So now that is what I call myself.